afternoon and welcome to the Board of County Commissioners Land Use Workshop. I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Merrill for an overview.
All right, better than what some people call me, but I'll take it. Commissioners, this is a follow-up to the previous workshop we had on land use issues. Since then, we went around one-on-one and visited with commissioners. So this is really taking the information we received and trying to shape a discussion about where we go next. With that, I'll turn it over to Ms. Garces to give.
Before we do that, Mr. Merrill and Ms. Garces, I want to bring up Mr. Ben Limmer, the Executive Director of HART. I don't know if he's been here before. Have him come up and give us a discussion of what his thought process is on land use and transportation issues as we go forward. So, Mr. Limmer, this your first time here?
It is.
I should harass you, but I'm not going to do that.
You should. Absolutely should.
And can you say your name again for the record, please?
Yeah, Benjamin Limmer. That's Limmer.
Well, welcome, Mr. Limmer.
Thank you. Happy to be here. Absolutely. So, let's see. I've been at HART just under 3 months. I've worked on public transportation expansion programs across the United States, and a few major capital projects, mostly in Cleveland, Phoenix, and Atlanta. So I've been lucky enough also to work on projects that had a variety of funding sources. But with that came a lot of planning and community work that did not involve running or building the transit operation component of each of these projects. Throughout my career, I've often partnered with localities, whether it's cities or counties or community organizations and neighborhood groups, to prepare particular neighborhoods or a street corridor or whatever it might be to be more transit supportive. That way, when the new transit project is built and it opens, that the line can see and maximize its success with regards to economic activity around the stations and the like. This is not only important to successful transit projects, and it's not only critical to provide a surrounding community that's more livable and walkable for everybody, but when the federal government is looking to advance major capital projects such as a light rail or a bus rapid transit or whatever it might be, they've actually over the years, especially since about the mid-2000s, have integrated more and more into how they review and how they fund projects, whether or not localities have done their part in preparing for economic growth around these station areas. So what they look for are land use policies, plans that really have teeth, zoning modifications, parking policies that are transit friendly. They look especially the last few years at what are your affordable housing policies and goals as they relate to your larger metropolitan area. And it's probably worth about 40% of the criteria that they use to fund transit projects. So it's critically important to the success of transit projects going forward, especially if you are seeking federal funding. So this can be done a variety of ways, but I've had models where there's dedicated staff within the transit agency of land use planners and economic development type staff, and or there's dedicated liaisons within each of the jurisdictions. So it's just as we move forward as a region planning for transit, even bus service, just having ways to coordinate amongst our differing, or our various entities on all of these land use planning components. So with that, I probably went over my time. I'd be happy to answer any questions or comments. Or
I don't see any. Mr. Limmer, let me thank you for coming in.
Of course.
I know you're running like crazy and all these good things, but hold up. Commissioner Smith, you recognize.
Thank you. And thank you very much for bringing Ben Limmer to us, and thanks so much for coming. I know how busy you are, but it's really important as we move forward into thinking about this framework that we are connecting with our transportation and transit component, given the paradigm shift that the voters have handed us in funding to really be doing some major transit component as we do this growth management fund framework. And thank you for pointing out to us that 40% of the criteria for federal funding, I had no idea, comes from having local plans that are going to assure them that transit-oriented development is happening at the same time as these projects. That's really important to know. I'm glad you came and told us.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Kemp, you recognize.
Thank you. I think it's great that you're here. We definitely need to be doing this in concert and not separately. We have to think about building a system between our roads and bicycles and our hopefully ferry, hopefully, in my mind, CSX tracks, the BRT. We have the express buses, which I want them to just be express buses on top of the interstate. And I'll say again, in terms of the 40% criteria, I think a couple of concepts, and that's why I think it's really important to integrate this, is I've said before, there's no such thing as highway-oriented development, that people on highways rightfully turn their back to the highways, and should, because they're toxic, poisonous places within 300 yards, as a watershed study has recently found out and been confirmed. And so I think we should be thinking about that. That's why I like, when I say transit-oriented development at street grade level, and where we, I think, need to develop and look at. So I'm really happy. I hope to have you be more a part of, I think HART has to be more a part of what we do when we look forward and move forward about how we develop and move the county.
Certainly, you have my commitment as an organization. We will be there to support the county as requested.
There's a concept of multimodal centers that I keep hearing about, and from looking at these multimodal centers, I have to say that they are, to me, rebranded parking garages, and have been primarily, and when I've looked at them around the state, that's what I've seen. So I just want to start to, when I see multimodal centers, my first questions are, what are the multimodes and how many parking spaces in that garage? So anyway, I just wanted to say that I don't just accept that they're multimodal centers just because they've been called that. And I just say that generally in planning and moving forward.
Commissioner Overman, you recognize.
Welcome, Mr. Limmer. You know, it's interesting. We've been sort of starting these conversations in several issues that we've been addressing. Perfect example of the concerns I have about how the Affordable Housing Advisory Board's mission is greater than just figuring out affordable housing, but how do we partner with our transit partners? How do we partner with our land use planners? That transportation is inclusive of transit. And when we're making decisions, for example, and yesterday on surplus lands, the first question for me as someone who's involved in transit and affordable housing is, how is that being considered? So I think we're at a place where we really can consider that in a greater way, and I'm looking forward to partnering with HART to help us manifest that, because we are in a community that economically, given the median income of the people who live here, in dire need of not only the transit support, but also to be responsible of how we're spending those transportation dollars so that we are best able to serve all of our citizens. So that those citizens that need affordable housing can also afford to get to work and get to the grocery stores and do those things. So that's hugely important, and you should be an integral part of that planning.
Will do.
I got to thinking that having HART do all the TOD makes little sense to me, because the county itself is looking at the land use, the land design, and and affordable housing. So while there needs to be transit-oriented development as far as the transit agency is concerned, they can't be mutually exclusive. I'm trying to tear down the silos where we forget things, or we don't do it as well because they weren't always part of the conversation. So I think it's critically important as we look at our framework that we take that into consideration, that not only is, our transportation department that develops our roads and streets and highways and byways and arterials and collectors to provide ways that people can get around in cars. Equally as important is the ways that we are able to develop the ways that people can get around using public transportation, no matter what the mode, whether it be buses or share rides or golf carts or scooters or, which I'm not crazy about, but, or eventually commuter rail or light rail or, high-speed rail, whether it be to Orlando. So I think it's critically important that there is a very close relationship in our growth plan with our transit alternatives as part of it. So thank you.
Commissioner White, you recognize.
Thank you. I'm working very hard to preserve the rural character of some communities in the southeastern stretches of our county. And in my mind, that complements the ideas that you hear being discussed here. Would you agree with that, or what are your thoughts on that?
Oh, absolutely. When you're looking at transit corridors or even non-transit corridors, there's the appropriate size and scale and type of different places. And it's critical for a region or county to have a mix, to have a diverse array of offerings regarding what's most appropriate for that particular area. And so absolutely, I would agree with that. And, furthermore, as you're looking at the transit corridor specifically, not every station's going to have the same level of mixed use. And then as you look at bus routes, maybe express services that only operate during the morning and afternoon peak hours, well, then the size of the, scale of activity around those areas would be appropriately scaled, and then areas not served by transit, or only areas that are served with the on-demand type paratransit operations, those would have a different look and feel and character of those areas. So,
Great.
Excellent.
Great. Well, you've told me to continue on with about a year's worth of hard work that I've been doing, and I'm getting close to the finish line. So thank you.
Commissioner Merwin, you recognize.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And quick question.
Of course.
I've been reading that transit-oriented development is not producing the results that everybody has been touting and talking about for some time. Are you familiar with any of that conversation, or do you know what's going on out there in the world with transit-oriented development?
Certainly. It was my first job in public transit. But absolutely, I mean, there's a variety of factors at play. You have the local land use policies, the zoning,
Right.
local zoning. There's some technical influences as far as what guides development, especially around transit corridors. You can also look at overall market environment. I've worked in a community where it was not growing rapidly, so in order to stimulate activity around station areas, it required a lot of work on the local government's part. So the success of TOD, I can boil it down to this. It's the strength in the local land use policies and zoning codes to be transit oriented, and not even transit oriented, but pedestrian oriented or people oriented on one hand. And then my responsibility is to provide a high quality, frequently operated transit service. And if you combine those two things, development will often follow, but again, it's going to be of different scale depending upon the station specific area. So
Great, thank you. That was a really good answer. And I hope that we can just kind of plant that in our heads, because it's not about so much having the transit hooked up to the development as it is letting the pedestrians be, the mobility be there for them.
Yeah,
And transit, if it's appropriate for that particular
certainly, and if I may, often from, only the T and TOD, I'm often pushing cities and counties and other jurisdictions to prepare for a transit investment. And I'm often pushing when we're early in the stages of planning and it's many years in the future before it's going to open. And so you all should be commended that you're taking this step now to help prepare for just a people-oriented places today and in the near future. So it's certainly being very proactive. And specific to how this type of work can support transit investments, I'd be happy to get our, at the staff level, get together and talk about some of those specific policies and other things that are most transit supportive.
Excellent, thank
Ms.
you.
Garces, you want to say something?
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Limmer. We have been collaborating. We're looking for additional ways to collaborate, and so we appreciate you coming down and talking about the importance of how this fits into some of the efforts that we have. I think what Mr. Limmer has described and the issues that you have raised are really underscoring why we need a framework. There are a number of things that are happening. We're looking at last board meeting, you heard about the innovation place and the importance of redeveloping innovation. You've heard about Brandon, you've heard about Little Manatee, you've heard about a number of initiatives that are underway. All things up to and including extension of water, wastewater policy, they all are related. And so the why part of why do we need a framework is to link all of these pieces together. And so what we have for you today is Chris Sinclair, who has come back with a presentation to really add some structure to the moving forward, the process, the product. And then what we have for you as well are a couple of other initiatives that we're working on that will feed this. One is a study that Cutter is undertaking for all of South County to look at how mobility happens. How do people travel? Do they travel by car? Is there an opportunity for them to move by foot? Can we make connections in certain places? And we have someone from Cutter who will talk about that. We'll also introduce a concept that's been here before about transfer development rights, and we have Professor Van Linkes who's here, and she has extensive experience in TDRs. So a lot of these issues that you have raised, this is the opportunity to bring them all together. They really then provide the foundation for moving forward with community plan updates, comprehensive plan updates. But this first piece of creating the strategic framework, we believe, is the most important part. So one other piece of just administrative information, we sent to you 2 slides that were inadvertently omitted in the PowerPoint. So you have those, they're in the hard copy, and they have been posted online as well. Took care of a couple of typos, and then that I think is the only pieces that deal with the backup information. So we'll have Chris kick it off, and then we'll go to the Cutter piece, and then to the TDR piece. And at the end, where we would like to be is the movement forward in bringing back the details of this structure.
Well, Mr. Limmer, let me thank you for coming in.
Thanks a lot for having me.
It's important to have you here as we move forward to have the transit agency working with this, our area and our department as we plan going forward. So thank you very much. We look forward to working with you some more.
Thank you much.
Okay. Mr. Sinclair, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Good to see all of you. Before I get started, I've just got to say, and I think I mentioned this in the meetings I had with each of you or most of you, that one of the things that I do is teach a TOD course for the Federal Transit Administration to teach them, localities and transit agencies across the country, how they get to that 40% of the criteria, what kind of policies they have to have in place, what good designs are. And we've been to at least 30 regions across the country. And Commissioner Merman, one of the things that's been fascinating is to find out what's worked and what hasn't worked in different places. So it's a fascinating topic. One of the reasons we were selected to do the federal work is because we put together the TOD guidelines for the state of Florida, which have been used. So let me get on to the presentation. So I'm going to start off with talking about the meetings we had with you all. Then talk about the organization of the framework, how we start linking things together, the process that we'll go through to get engagement and feedback from the stakeholders and the public. Talk about the structure, and that's when we're going to have Van and Christine come up and talk. So thank you for the meetings that we had. They were very informative. There were some areas that were consistent. There was a consistent set of themes that came out of our conversations. One was preserve environmental and rural areas. Secondly, develop a multimodal transportation system that includes transit, bike, and walking. Develop higher intensity mixed-use places within the urban services area that pivots off the multimodal transportation. Enhance community identity. Provide job opportunities and affordable housing opportunities, and then provide fiscally sound services and infrastructure. So those were the common themes that we got from those discussions. We also got fairly specific recommendations or ideas of what we need to consider as we move forward. One was to consider a sector plan model or something similar to that. Use this process to feed the next generation of community plans and the vision behind those plans. Maintain the urban services area boundary. Use mechanisms like TDRs and other kinds of strategies for environmental protection. Focus and the community engagement focuses more on values than on specific growth projections. A lot of ideas about multimodal transportation and how that could be provided. One was to purchase CSX rail lines for light rail transit, provide bus rapid transit corridors, transit along US 301 in South County, develop ferry service, develop and create street grids. And then finally, there was discussions and ideas about economic and community development, including looking at and perfecting the innovation district, looking at what can happen along the I-4 corridor in concert with Plant City, looking at what can be done in terms of enhancing Brandon, and then South County as an area for potential opportunities. So these are the things we're starting the strategic framework out with: environmental and rural preservation, job opportunities and affordable housing, community identity, multimodal transportation, higher intensity mixed-use places in support of that, and fiscally sound services and infrastructure. And the outcomes should give us a synthesis of what the community values, not only at the county level, but down at the community level. It should give provide some economic support for the decisions, the plans and the policy decisions that come out of this, as well as fiscal consequences of the scenarios, and comfort with the fact that you're moving forward with a plan that can be sustainable fiscally over the long term. And most importantly, identify the opportunities for jobs, transit, environmental preservation, rural preservation, and affordable housing. So those were the common themes that came out of the process. Remember that this is from the last presentation, that the purpose of the strategic framework is to provide a mechanism for stitching the pieces together, as Lucia mentioned earlier. The strategic framework, once it's adopted, will be used to update the comprehensive plan, and we talked to the Planning Commission about that and how that could work. It is to support the development of a mid-range strategic facility investments plan. It is to be used to help retool the community plans and then help recalibrate the land development code. And there's other ways that the strategic framework can be used moving forward. So the organization of the framework, what was intriguing, there is a planning process at the state level called the sector plan process. What's intriguing about it is the fact that it provides this framework at a larger level that provides clarity as to how all the pieces come together. but it doesn't presume to know all of the details. So then you do a detailed specific area plan that uses all of the framing mechanisms and tools and ideas at the larger level and applies it at a more specific level. This is not going to be a sector plan. This is going to be something that's similar in structure, but it's going to be tailored specifically for the issues that you identified moving forward. First of all, the long-term framework is going to play off the guiding principles that you've already adopted. There will be a framework map and typologies that go with that map, and I'll show you what those are in just a minute. The discussions that we had will be part of the guiding principles that will be moving us forward. There will be a bridging plan that starts getting into how do you implement the framework plan, the map and the plan and the typologies. It'll have some policy guidance in it. It'll have ideas and recommendations in terms of strategies, investments, such as should there be a TDR program for environmental protection? How do you coordinate with HART to pull all these things together? And then it will also have coordination and sequencing and timing of activities. That kind of information is where we stop, and that information then is being used to update the comprehensive plan and ultimately get down to the level of community plans. There are 4 elements that we're proposing to start stitching it together. One is environmental and rural preservation. The second is economic and community development. The third is multimodal transportation and placemaking. And the fourth is services, infrastructure, and fiscal. We do have Van and Christine to talk about how their work will start informing what we're doing and moving forward. We'll also have the work that's been advertised on the street for fiscal analysis will be part of what we're thinking about, will be pulled into what we are doing. We'll be working closely with a lot of different partners, including the Planning Commission, MPO, and HART. So the process that we will go through, 3 major phases. One is just to get context set. The second is to build the long-term framework, and the third is to create the bridging plan. And each one of those, there's going to be a technical part of what we do, and there's going to be an engagement part of what we do. In terms of the engagement, we're recommending the creation of 3 steering committees, one in the northwest part of the county, the second in the east part of the county, and the third in the south part of the county, with representation from different walks of life and different interests and perspectives. And the purpose for this steering committee is to maintain continuity throughout the process. These people will be people that we will continually go back to and say, what are you hearing? This is what we're getting out of the community meetings. And one of the things that they will be doing that I think will be extremely valuable for the process is helping us design the community engagement activities, because the way the activities are going to work is going to be less of people reacting to our ideas and more us sitting down and helping people design what they want and how they want it. They are going to be actively engaged, and steering committees, I have found, are very effective at giving us some insight about how that happens. The second is going to be a plan information network, again, for the Northwest, East, and South. This is going to be throughout, this group is going to be engaged throughout the process. Their primary responsibility is making connections into civic groups, interest groups, different organizations around the county, so that they can be used to both get information out to people about upcoming meetings, and they can get feedback from their groups and provide it back to us during the process. And it's a very effective way to maintain that continuity and connection with the community. And again, we'll have a series of community and virtual meetings and workshops where people are asked to participate, not react, but participate. So in terms of setting the context, the primary technical task here is to collect all of the information that's out there and pull it together into what we call the virtual present. But it's also an opportunity to go out to the communities and start listening to them about what they value, particularly as it relates to the strategic framework and the community identity and what they think of their communities, and how can this process help them get to their aspirations. So from those engagements, we'll be able to start distilling values that not only are unique to each of the different communities, but what values bubble up that are common to the entire county. In the long-term framework task, what we're going to do there is our starting place for that is going to be the hybrid scenario that was adopted by the Planning Commission and the MPO. It's our it's our starting point. What we're going to be doing is going to the community and asking them to give us ideas about how to take their ideas about community identity and merge it in with that overall framework that's been created by the hybrid scenario. It's also an opportunity for us to start detailing out the hybrid scenario and adding meat to the bones that are already out there. So the workshops are going to be engaged about how these things start playing themselves out. And the technical task will be adding and fleshing out the details of that starting point. And then finally, the bridging plan is where we come up with the framework map, the typologies behind the framework map, and we now have some ideas about where we want to go, what we want to do. The bridging plan is how do we get there? That's the fundamental question. What strategies do we use? Who needs to be involved and who needs to be engaged? And again, we're going to go back out to the community and get their reactions to and insights about what can be used in order to implement the framing plan. So just to give you a sense of what the long-term framework will look like, again, there's 4 different elements. I'm going to start with environmental and rural preservation. It will be a map, and the map will have information on it of different kinds of activities or unique conditions that need to be paid attention to. And it's going to be able to start bringing all of these different things together. So the types that we're considering or that we'll be thinking about for environmental land typology, it could be these are the areas that are permanently protected. There could be another category. These are the lands that we want to have enhanced habitat protection. And there's different strategies that are going to be related to each one of these different typologies. The third could be wildlife corridors. There's a purpose for these wildlife corridors. Let's maintain that purpose. So that's the kinds of things we're going to be putting into the typologies. We'll have a rural land typology where we'll be looking at active agriculture, not only for now, but over the long term, active mining, rural residential, possibly other categories. A third area that we're going to be looking at because it's becoming more and more important is resiliency. And we can pivot off some really good work that the Tampa Bay Planning Commission has been doing, Council has been doing in terms of storm surge and flood zone work. In terms of economic and community development, here we're going to be focusing in on job centers and community centers. How big are they going to be? What's their design going to be like? What's the intended jobs that are going to be located in these places? Or if it's a community center, what kind of services will be provided within those community centers? What kind of structure and framework will they have moving forward? We'll also start looking at neighborhoods and the dynamics of neighborhoods that are stable, neighborhoods that need attention in different kinds of ways will be identified in that and how we move forward with those neighborhoods. And then finally, that connection that Mr. Limmer was talking about earlier, bringing transportation and placemaking together. So we'll be working with HART, we'll be working with the MPO to understand what kind of technologies make sense in the premium transit corridors. The most important thing that you need to start nailing down when you're doing TOD is where are the station locations. It's a fundamental aspect of getting your land use policies and plans lined up properly. It is the pivot point. It is the geographic center of the world when it comes to TOD. Then we'll be dealing with what kinds of TODs are there going to be. Mr. Limmer talked about the different kinds of TODs that are out there. Some are very job-oriented and fairly intense, like downtown Tampa. Some are more residentially oriented, and some are a mix between the two. So we'll be defining and pinning those things down as well, but in coordination with HART and with the MPO and with the city, with both Temple Terrace, Tampa, and possibly Plant City. And then finally, the services, infrastructure, and fiscal aspect of it. Services and service delivery and fiscal considerations do vary by place type. And I think that's what the work that you all have coming up is going to address. But it also will vary about where you are within the county. Are you in an urban infill area? Are you in a suburban infill area? Or you're in a community redevelopment area? Each of these places poses a different kind of demand on services and how those services are provided. They also provide some feedback about the fiscal conditions that are coming out of those different places. So that's the structure of the framework plan, and this map and these typologies will give you, and most importantly, but others that you need to coordinate with, clarity about how you want to move forward. It pulls these things together and it starts connecting the dots. So Commissioner White, it starts talking about This is where we're going to get intensity within these urban corridors. These are where the receiving zones, and this is going to be in support of multimodal transportation. So this is how it starts tying together. Finally, when we were talking with you, most of you mentioned there are 4 key areas that you wanted us to pay attention to. One was the Innovation District, the second was the I-4 corridor, and the third was Brandon, and the fourth was South County. And I think you all, when you mention these places, you recognize these are the places where economic development will take place. These are the places where multimodal transportation will take place. In other words, these are fairly strategic areas in terms of the overall construct and how things can change, fundamentally change in the county moving forward. So Christine Williams is here. She has been working on the South County Mobility Study, and she's going to provide some insights about some of her findings, which have been very informative to me, just understanding what's going on in South County. And it gives me and it'll give the project team some fodder for moving forward.
Before she starts, just
Excuse me, Mr. Sinclair?
Oh, yeah.
Commissioner White wants to ask something. Commissioner White, you recognize?
Thank you. There's something, I'm probably getting in the weeds a little bit, but I think it bears mentioning. If you could go back to your slide that's titled Environmental and Rural Preservation.
Yes.
I just think it bears mentioning that for the wildlife corridor bullet point, I think everyone at this dais knows that I'm a huge supporter of our ELAP program, but I also recognize that we cannot either purchase fee simple or conservation easements on every acre of land in this county. So I just wanted to point out that I've spoken with multiple professional ecologists that have said that preserving large lot rural development patterns is also an effective way to preserve wildlife corridors. So I just wanted to put that on the record for all it's worth.
Commissioner Kemp, you recognize?
Thank you. I also have and this is something I've just recently learned about with all this focus on the I-4 corridor and seemingly developing it out. I don't know if you're familiar, but there's a film that's been made just recently called Last Green Thread. I think I was looking for the title there. Last Green Thread. It focuses on the I-4 corridor. It's about a 25-minute film, and as it goes across the state from east to west. And what it is creating is a barrier for wildlife to cross it, much like Alligator Alley, and it's focusing and creating a lack of biodiversity to the south of it and to the north. There's only 3 places on the map that's left that for wildlife to actually cross that's not in an urbanized area or highly developed area. And 2 of those, or at least I think one of those, I'm looking at this map though more precisely, is between Tampa and Plant City across the entire state. That's one of the places. The other place is on the other side of Plant City to Lakeland. That's it. Those are the places that are left for wildlife to possibly cross, except that they can't because the I-4 isn't made for it. So I think that we have to start, I want to do everything I can to start to look at this in terms of FDOT, raising that road, doing what they have to do for Alligator Alley, and us looking at a way that we can create a pathway for wildlife to go from the other parts of our county underneath that road, through whatever places that we can think about how that has to be preserved. I don't, know how to move forward with that, but I'm quite alarmed by that prospect.
In fact, Commissioner Overman also made a comment about that very connectivity and paying attention to that area. Actually, I think there's maybe 2 opportunities. One is between Tampa and Plant City, and one's between Lakeland and Plant City. But that's part of what we'll be looking at and defining where those opportunities are, and at least conveying those intentions to the partners, what will include FDOT. And by the way, you have another potential partner, and that's Virgin Railway, or whatever it is, that's going to be coming across that same corridor.
Okay, Mr. Sinclair, I had a question, but I'll wait. Ms. Williams, good afternoon.
Let me get you.
I think they have wildlife.
Right.
Sorry.
You're right, I do remember now.
Go.
So, good afternoon, Commissioners. I'm Christine Williams of Cutter. I'm here to give you a short update on the South County mobility study that we've been working on starting about this time last year, and some of the information that we're gathering that will feed into the county's ongoing planning efforts, and in particular the strategic framework. The objectives of the study are to document those baseline transportation and land use conditions in South County, to serve as a foundation for the mobility strategy. And we've been looking at a number of plans, studies, and improvement programs that have been worked on to date by the various agencies, looking at land use conditions and activity areas, development entitlements, and connections to the activity areas. We've performed an origin-destination analysis using streetlight data, which is cell phone-based aggregated data. And we've looked at multimodal accessibility issues, particularly with regard to transit, walking, and cycling potential. We started by looking at more than 30 plans and studies of the various agencies involved, and including the many plans, Hillsborough County, the Planning Commission, the MPO, Florida DOT, Port Tampa Bay, which is involved in the expansion of the Port Red Wing, T-BARTA, of course, HART, and the 7 community plans within that study area that were integrated into the livable communities element. So my goal today really is just to give you a flavor of the types of information we're gathering, and I'm going to use Gibsonton as kind of a platform for sharing that information with you. So looking at Gibsonton, Gibsonton, of course, is unique, and there are many unique communities within the South County region. They have identified a desire for improved walkability, safer intersections, and affordable public transportation. And that desire, along with the desire for a town center, creating Gibsonton as something of a signature corridor or Main Street that was reflected in the community plan, was really a common theme of the many plans and community plans and studies that we looked at in the South County region. I think that there was a general desire for walkability. And they also looked at that corridor for small business development. In terms of the origin-destination analysis, we were interested in where are people going? Where are they traveling to? What's the purpose of the trip? How are they getting there? And what time are they traveling? What time of day? And all of that information has been aggregated for each of the areas. And here you can see much of the travel in Gibsonton, for example, is headed either over to the activity area at Gibsonton Drive and I-75, where there's a lot of shopping and services, or up to the north via the 2 main north-south corridors, US 41 and I-75. And you can see that from a geographic perspective in terms of the spider graph, as well as kind of the proportion of trips overall that are comprising that trip pattern. And there is a certain extent they're going to businesses along US 41. They're peaking in the morning and evening, indicating that commuting pattern is happening. But those work trips are about 16% of the total. So a lot of the trip making occurs throughout the day and in different contexts and is not related to that trip to work. And this really is in contrast to places like Sun City Center or Apollo Beach, where a lot of that trip is internal to those community planning areas and peaking really during the midday period. So that's, in that case, suggesting a need for more internal connections. And so this information will really help inform the types of strategies to accommodate each need of these areas. And that chart is a little technical. It's color-coded, so please do let me know if you need any help interpreting it. So we're also doing detailed inventories.
Excuse me, Ms. Williams?
Yes, sir.
I think Commissioner Overman has a question.
Yes, sir.
Sorry, and I
Yes,
don't
ma'am.
want to get you off kilter, but
Sure.
on that graph, it's really interesting. There's a pretty heavy, thick line to the pink dot that's off to the right. I can't tell where it is, but what did, the one to the south, keep going, down, 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 right there. What's that location?
So this is generally Riverview.
All right.
We called it Riverview and Baum. It's quite a
Okay,
large
okay.
area, and it's just,
It kind of looked like it was there, but I was trying to think what is right exactly there.
it's illustrating the number of trips in proportion to this overall zone.
Okay, okay, great, thank you very much. Sorry.
Any other?
Before, yep, hold on. Before we get to Commissioner Kemp, it's kind of busy map to me. The question that Commissioner Overman asked, the Riverview area, what's the significance of the small circles and the large circles? Is that the volume?
That gives you a general sense of the order of magnitude of the trips. And in Gibsonton, really, we're not talking about a large number of trips, say an example in relation to a place like Riverview, which had probably 29,000 trips during the day, or actually more than that. So that's just an order of magnitude in terms of where are people mostly going to.
Okay. Commissioner Kemp, you recognize.
Thank you. I have seen a lot of these and looked at them very closely, and the thing that I think doesn't work for me in this one in particular is I guess when usually I see from the destination, but your destination seems to be like from Gibsonton to 75, or so once you get on 75, that's the end of it. So you don't know if maybe they were headed to, wherever on 75, or maybe if they were on 41, they were going to downtown Tampa or whatever. So we don't see end destinations, and that's kind of a problem for me, because then we don't know where they, once they hit those big roads, where they're actually going to. Because I know in South County a lot, and I know that Commissioner Smith knows this, when you're out there and talking to people, people are saying, we want to get to Tampa. Don't say we want to get to Brandon. They say we want to get to Tampa. I hear all the time. Mm-hmm. And so I'm just saying that because this doesn't give us a clue of where they're actually going to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there are limitations in terms of streetlight data and just the budget in general in terms of how many different zones we can identify. I will say that 77% of the total trips in the South County region are internal to that region. And about 20% of our total trips are commute trips. So we aren't seeing necessarily all the destinations, but generally the pattern going north is headed toward Tampa. And
that is key information, that 77% are within that area, because again, I've always, as far as the commuter studies show that if you turn a key in Hillsborough County, 91% of the time when you're commuting to work, you end up in Hillsborough County. I think it's really important for people to note that when they're thinking about how we develop commuter transit, for instance. So that's interesting that 77% end up there. And is that a commuter figure, or is that just a general figure for all day long?
Total trips, total
Okay.
personal trips.
Okay, thank you.
And this is a very rich data set. We're still interpreting it ourselves. We have the exact number of trips for each time of day from each of these origins and destinations as well.
Your map has brought about a lot of questions.
Yes.
Commissioner White, you recognize.
Yes, thank you. Are you actively collecting data for this?
We've completed our data collection and reduced the data into these charts and tables as well, and are putting that together and documenting that.
When did you complete the data collection?
Just these past few months.
Because I tell you, looking at this map, And I know I'm probably going off on a little bit of a tangent, but it makes me think of all the different moving parts and pieces of this large organization in Hillsborough County government. Because I'm surprised to see that Brandon Valrico, didn't show up as a region, because I mean, I have to tell you, one single land use decision has made, in my mind, a significant difference in trip generation, and that's the approval of that movie theater in Gibsonton. And I have to tell you, a lot of residents, my family and I included, are making, Gibsonton is now a destination for us to go to the movies. And when I start thinking about all the moving parts and pieces, Regency is not doing real well. And unless they can pull off a major remodel or something to draw people back in there, I'm not so sure they're going to make it. So then we start talking about code enforcement and a blighted plaza. And, Mike, I've taken you on a field trip out to some blighted storefronts out in East County, and everything seems to sort of fall in this domino effect. So it's just fascinating to look at this. And, to your point about breaking down silos, we have to look at all these different moving parts and pieces. Again, it's a great theater. I love it. I'm going there, but unfortunately, it's likely to create now a void in the Brandon area. And to the extent that we can keep our eye on the ball on that, either through the Economic Development Department or whatever the appropriate department would be, I think we have to look at that big picture. So,
Who would have thought that your map would start talking about movies? Mr. Merman, you recognize.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the maps. It really, I've been talking about Gibsonton for quite some time. Actually was to help them do their community plan when they first did it back in, I think it was 1998. But anyway, the central point of this, is that Gibsonton Drive?
It's the overall zone that you see represented in light blue.
Okay, so actually that circle is really everything in light blue.
Yes.
Because honestly, the growth in Gibsonton is about a mile south. I mean, there's probably 2,000 homes along Sims Drive. And I know there is a great deal of traffic going down Sims to 301 to get to the Publix at 301 and Big Bend. Because they don't have a grocery store in Gibsonton. So, and the reason they don't have a grocery store in Gibsonton is because they aren't connected to county water in that shopping center there, and that's why they left to begin with. Most of the businesses. So there you go. I'm telling you, you got, and really, I've been talking about this since I've been here. But we've got to make commitments to infrastructure. If we're doing land use, infrastructure's got to be included in the discussion, because Gibsonton is a great place for redevelopment. I've always said it. And I talk to these residents constantly. They are just begging us to help them do something. But I don't know that this map really captures all the trips that I know about that are going down Sims Road one way or the other, either to get to 41 to go to work or go to the other to get to the commercial stuff. So I guess I don't know about your survey and how it all encompassed, but I know there's more trips than 146 coming from that zone going south. I mean, it doesn't kind of make sense to me.
And we also have that area of Gibsonton and US 41 as a separate zone. So we've parsed the zones in this area in order to get a rich look at the origin and destination traffic. But I did see exactly what you're talking about, Commissioner, in terms of, in addition to that area around I-75, There was some draw over to 301 in the intersection of 301 and Gibsonton Drive, and so yes, I think.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Smith, you recognize.
Quick question. When you said 77% of the trips in South County, was it 77% of the trips in South County stay in South County? How big is South County when you say that? What area?
The study area that we used started at the Alafaya River, went all the way south to the urban growth boundary. So that is north of Little Manatee, and then east over to the urban growth boundary, just east also of the urban growth boundary, to capture some of the areas that are currently, I think, designated as RP2. And that was the broader study area that we used.
Okay, and 77% of the trips within that area, which is, bigger than this Gibsonton area, stays within that area. So a lot of people taking their kids to school and going to the grocery store, wherever they go, within that large area.
Yes, so we also have the trip purpose, which is home-based work, which is your commute trip, home-based other, which is all your other trip making, and non-home-based, which is those trips when you're in a shopping area and you're circulating around, or you're going from shopping area to shopping area.
I would love to drill down into all of that data if we can, set up a briefing aside from the workshops. Yeah.
Yes, and we're very happy to do that and come in and do a more detailed briefing.
Yeah, that's right.
Our final report is going to be complete, as I said, later this summer. And really my goal today was just to give you a flavor of it to kind of feed into the strategic framework discussions that you're having.
And the last question, so these lines, though, that go from one area to another area, it's that whole area to that other whole area, and it's either to or from?
To and from.
Okay.
Total.
Thank you.
Commissioner Merman, you recognize.
This is quick. HART did a circulator study in South County that I hope is being put into the mix. You guys are HART board members now, but we need circulator service in South County. And I had to beg to get the Waimama started down 674. But this is critical to this community and them getting around. And I mean, you can't say just working on it. I'll be honest with you. You say you're working on it. I've been working on it for 8 years. So what's the problem? What's holding it up? And I know it's money, but it just can't continue. We cannot continue to not offer service in South County. And that's all I'll say on that subject, but there is circulator study.
Mr. Merrill.
So, Commissioners, I'd like to, on the note of the sort of the granularity and the adequacy of the data, it gets us to a certain point, and it really is data that we haven't analyzed before. So we are learning things about travel patterns. And to your point, Commissioner, it does help us understand who's traveling around and who's traveling out. I think there's another piece the board has asked us to undertake. For a number of quarters, we're doing these studies that are called planning and land use studies along various corridors, and Gibsonton Road is one of them. So we are looking at the more next level of granularity and the next level of travel patterns. So that begins to be a complement to this work, which is done at a little bit of a higher level. So then once we see patterns, we start to drill down, and we'll have those then come before you or get incorporated into the planning process as well.
Okay, you can continue.
And I'll just add that we have been in conversations with HART staff, and they're very interested in these findings and in understanding better accessibility around the activity areas. So we're also collecting lots of data on network and safety conditions in a cross-section of the community planning areas, with a focus on bicycle, pedestrian, and transit conditions in the community. And here, for example, we observed some missing network, a lack of network connectivity, and bicycle pedestrian crashes that are clustered along the major routes. Including where the HART transit service is currently provided. And we're also looking at some crash reports to understand those more clearly. With regard to transit access, we're finding issues associated with the safety and comfort of transit users, safe crossings, shelters, the quality of shelters, sidewalk connections, and the need for sidewalk connections is another focus that we've had in terms of documenting the information. And we're also assessing the convenience and safety of pedestrian access to shopping and other services from the surrounding area. And for example, here you can see the suburban built environment poses a number of challenges to pedestrians. And it stands in contrast to the desire for a walkable town center that was expressed in the community plan. So this just really concludes my comments today. I just wanted to give you a flavor of some of our findings, and I'll certainly be happy to provide you with a more detailed briefing. I'm going to turn it back to Chris now.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Williams. Mr. Sinclair.
So I think what Christine presented, there was an aspiration in Gibson to create a Main Street, a place where people can come together that's multimodal, that's walkable. And so one of the things that we'll be addressing in the strategic framework is there's also an intent in the MPO's plan to put premium transit. Either it's on I-75, 301, CSX alignment. That needs to be determined through this process working with HART and the MPO. The question then becomes, how does this relationship start coming together between that intention of Gibsonton and any potential premium transit investment that needs to be made? And that's part of the conversation that we have to have. We also have to really think through environmental preservation, and we have with us Van Linkus from USF. Commissioner Kemp?
Commissioner Kemp, you're recognized.
Before we move to the next part,
Wait a minute, hold on. Commissioner Overman was in. I'm sorry. Commissioner Overman, you're recognized.
It relates to both of those points. I know that's not part of your presentation, but back on the Gibsonton inventory slide, that talks about the injuries and fatalities and the HART lines. It's just looking at this, given where the HART stops are, where the HART routes are, and where the pedestrian fatalities and bike fatalities and injuries are, that we have done a really not so great balance between helping people get up and down Gibsonton Road, as well as 41, and I'm not sure how we ended up with a bicycle injury on 75, but I guess it does happen. But more importantly, on that corridor where we're expecting people to walk to get to a bike, the road is not designed for it to be fair to pedestrians or cyclists in the way it's designed.
Yes.
So while this may say, well, we don't want transit there because there's too many injuries, because at every stop there seems to be a fatality, we need to flip that conversation to make Vision Zero critically important to find most balanced approach in those kinds of corridors. Not every corridor is going to be, for bikes.
Right.
Because it's going to, like 75 is not really a good corridor for bicycles.
Right.
Not every corridor in this community is going to be great for bikes, but some where we've decided a Main Street belongs, where we're going to have transit, we've got to find that balance in how we look at those roads when we're designing them. Even though they may be a primary corridor like Sims is becoming. Sims is getting to a place where it's got a lot of traffic in it, but it probably has a similar condition where there's not that balance between bikes and people and cars in a way that keeps them safe. And I think that's one of the things we cannot miss in this process.
I agree.
Absolutely cannot miss in this process.
Yeah.
Because transit won't survive. People will not walk to the bus stop if they can't get there safely. People don't ride their bikes if they can't ride it on there safely. And I think we need to get back to that before we start spending a whole lot of money on roads to fix the complete street situation if we aren't real about what it's going to take to make them safe.
You know, I was going to add to that, you got to think about the land use as well and the
Right.
design of buildings, the placement of buildings, the intensities, the mixes of uses. Because people not only walk to transit, they like to walk to destinations. They like to walk to the movie theater that Commissioner White was talking about.
Now, Commissioner Kemp, sorry about that.
Thank you. Actually, when you look at this too, and to the point of Commissioner Merman, Sims is a really critical road that is really in need, I think, more of becoming part of that whole network down there and being one to look at. Also, just to your point that you just made, all the studies are showing that the best best Vision Zero corridors, the fewest pedestrian and bicycle fatalities, are in corridors with transit, because the whole thing works together. And communities that have more transit have lower pedestrian and bicycle fatalities. It's a joint mix. So I'd just like to say that. But I also think there's a lot of definitional, sometimes imprecision, and it leads to confusion at times. When you define premium transit, can you just say what that is?
Yeah, in fact, that's something that FTA incorporates into this class that I teach. Premium transit is transit that runs in its own right-of-way.
Okay.
It's not mixed with, and it can be any technology. It could be heavy rail, light rail, buses, express buses, but it's got dedicated right-of-way.
Okay, and I'll just say this. I don't really think it's valuable, and I haven't seen it anywhere in the country that I've seen where you have a dedicated right-of-way on an interstate that has ever lasted. They tried to even do it in the D.C. area for transit. So I don't see where there is an example of that or where it's a valuable thing. Just saying.
You're right, it doesn't exist. I will say there are managed lanes that have buses with traffic, but not exclusive bus lanes.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Commissioners.
Pull the mic in front of you, ma'am.
I'm sorry. I have not previously been before this board, so I'll just briefly introduce myself. I'm Evangeline Linkus. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Urban and Regional Planning at USF in the School of Public Affairs. Before I served in this role, I am a certified planner. I was a professional planner involved in projects including transit-oriented development, farmland preservation, food system planning, and community engagement. And in my academic role, what I do today, I teach courses on growth management, I publish on growth management. I'm best known for my research on transferable development rights, and that's what I'm going to be introducing to this group today as part of thinking about strategies that could work in support of the strategic framework. The remainder of my research looks at other market-based tools for land use planning and property rights. And I've been published in the Journal of the American Planning Association, which is the flagship journal of the American Planning Association on transferable development rights. And in particular, that article looks at the way these programs have worked in Florida, among other articles. So thank you for the opportunity to talk about this area of my research. Okay, so as I said, this is a very introductory overview of transferable development rights. So transferable development rights are considered the leading strategy of the smart growth movement and growth management in general. And this is because a primary focus of growth management, or smart growth, is the clear identification of areas to which growth should be directed and where growth is appropriate, and areas that should be preserved for things like rural, agricultural, and environmental uses. So TDR is important to this strategy because it enables the redistribution of existing development potential by enabling a market for the sale of development rights. So it works off the concept of the bundle of rights, which is illustrated on this diagram here. And this allows that right to develop land to be severed and sold. So in general, when a local government implements a TDR program, it designates a sending area which targeted for protection. So in the illustration here, we're talking about open space. And this could be environmental, agricultural, rural areas, and a receiving area appropriate for more intense development. So with the TDR program, landowners in the sending area can sell their development rights, but continue to use their remaining land use rights, such as mineral rights, access rights, the right to sell. And developers can purchase those severed rights to develop and apply those for additional development entitlements in a receiving area. So it's moving the right to develop sort of across the playing field. Landowners in the sending, so typically TDR has 3 functions, and usually these are integrated, but in fact a TDR program could just have 1 or 2 or all 3 of these. So these are to redistribute development rights for the desired land use outcomes, to mitigate property rights impacts where land is being regulated, and it can also leverage private dollars for resource protection where local government funds for land preservation are limited, which Commissioner White, you brought that topic up. Okay, so just for a brief overview of sort of TDR in practice in the U.S. So there are more than 239 programs in the U.S. It is considered one of the more popular tools for smart growth. In Florida alone, there are 20 counties that use TDR, and these represent more than 31 county-level TDR programs. There are also a wide variety of municipal TDR programs. The leading TDR program in the U.S., and by leading, I'm talking about the number of acres that these programs have preserved. That's the standard measure for TDR success, is in King County, Washington, which is the Seattle area, and that program has preserved 141,500 acres. So profound impacts through TDR here. This program is unique in a few ways, including that it is structured as a partnership with the City of Seattle, which acts as the receiving areas. And this program's success also relies in large part on county purchase of development rights through its environmentally sensitive land acquisition program. So that's a contribution that I make in a lot of my research. The more successful TDR programs I have found are often integrated with county purchase of development rights. More than 2/3 of the land protected in King County's program were purchased by the county and resold through its TDR bank, and that's an innovative arrangement that supports a revolving fund for land management and acquisition. And these public efforts in King County are complemented by private market TDR sales, which make up about 1/3 of the credit exchanges. So many TDR programs are located in areas with unique and valued environmental and agricultural contexts. The scenic vistas and the mountain ranges in the King County area and the forestry there is important for protection there. Other popular and well-known successful TDR programs are in Montgomery County, Maryland, and Lancaster County, where the agricultural community strongly values their commitment to farmland and keeping farmland vital. So research on TDR indicates that it is not a silver bullet. It's not going to be all things. It does need to be integrated with an overall land use policy framework that supports smart growth. So the primary reason that TDR programs fail is when land use policies overall allow for the achievement of desired development potential without TDR. In other words, you can't give away density because in a TDR program, that's not part of the design. Rather, well-designed TDR programs capture the value of additional density allowances that are desired, such as those that might be connected to new transit investments and economic development infrastructure. So researchers have identified an evolution in TDR policy over time. First-generation TDR programs were a little bit simple, not especially successful. In the 1980s and 1990s, more attention got paid to the market viability. These work when they are tied to the market dynamics because they are really a market program. So in the second generation, first generation, you saw rural to urban TDR transfers, and that's how classic TDR programs, when you see them in a textbook, are going to be illustrated. But in that second generation, attention to the market dynamics had TDR programs where you had sending areas, again, in the rural areas, the agricultural and environmental areas, and receiving areas, oftentimes on the urban fringe where the new development was desired and where there was a strong market for that. Third-generation TDR programs continue to pay a lot of attention to those market dynamics. And in the third generation, and in particular in Florida, you see rural-to-rural transfers that allow for new town development where there's a mix of compact development and conservation, often in conjunction with a sector plan or similar kind of long-term process.
Excuse me, we have a question from Ms.
Sure.
Commissioner Overman. Commissioner Overman, you recognize?
Thank you for your comments regarding the second and new generation, greater attention to market viability regarding the rural to fringe transfer. So the fringe would be, for example, along I-4 beyond the urban service area, but an area where there is certain amount of natural development occurring, but it's sort of maybe against our growth policy, but it's on a major corridor. So, you know, it has rural all around it. By rule of thumb, we wouldn't want to grow to it, but because it's right there, it might be something you would want to transfer the rights from the rural area to that to allow for that kind of development? Is that what you're talking about when you mentioned fringe?
So in each community, the dynamics are a little bit different. But what this typically means is areas sort of right where you're at the border between the urban and the rural areas. And communities that are savvy are looking at where development pressure is happening in that context. So you're looking at places where you've got transportation investments or a transportation corridor that would be inviting to a new density and additional development.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Sure. All right, I'm going to move on. Okay, so there are many policy decisions involved for local governments as they implement TDR programs, and I'm just going to highlight some of the pieces that relate to conservation easements. So in developing a TDR program, one of the decisions that has to be made is about the conservation easements that will apply when those development rights are severed from the sending areas. So typically, when these development rights are sold, a conservation easement in a TDR program would be applied in perpetuity. And for example, in the context of a TDR farmland program, such as those in Montgomery County, Maryland, a farmer could typically continue to farm her land, sell or pass on the land to her heirs, and live on the property depending on the terms of the easement, but generally could not subdivide and develop land because the easement, after the TDR credits are sold, runs with the land. So even the heirs could not subdivide or develop the land. So perpetual easements in TDR programs really signal that rural preservation, agricultural preservation, environmental preservation is a long-range strategy, and that promotes those investments in the agricultural community, reduced uncertainty in the market, and increases market demand for TDR credits. And it promotes that long-term investment that supports rural economic development. Alternatively, a small minority of TDR programs use time-limited TDR conservation easements. Those signal that the rural landscape may change over time. This can depress the market for TDR credits because there's the idea that maybe this won't stay in agricultural or environmental use over time. But the benefit to that approach is that it does provide flexibility over the long term. Finally, communities do have to ask hard questions about what entity is prepared to manage the easement. So options here include the local government or the land trust, and that innovation that I spoke about that King County does, where they are purchasing development rights and then banking them and reselling them, those kinds of funds support local government's ability to manage the conservation easements and continue acquisition. And that concludes my brief overview of TDR for growth management. And I invite questions, or I can turn it over to Chris.
Commissioner White, you recognize.
Very briefly, I'll keep this short, Mr. Chairman. I'm looking at this conservation easement page, and it looks like kind of an all or nothing scenario where if you own 100 acres, you're selling off all the development rights and it remains as a 100-acre tract. I know what I've been sort of thinking of is if you have 100 acres in our area where you're allowed 1 unit per 10 acres, I'm sort of envisioning a scenario where you could still divide it into the 10-acre tracts, but you would sell off the right to get, say, a comprehensive plan amendment and eventually at some time get more density. Can it work that way? Have you seen any models like that, or can you envision a scenario where that would work?
So in terms of the rights to develop and how many acres that corresponds to, that really has to be tailored to the community and the kind of preservation. So in Montgomery County, Maryland, I think it's about 1 unit per 50 acres, but that's a different kind of agriculture than we have here in Florida. In Florida, and in particular in this region with produce and the kind of agricultural production we have here, I don't think you'd see quite that large of a scale, the 1 unit per 50 acres. So, looking at sort of the community dynamics around agriculture, I think that sort of scale would have to be adjusted. And then certainly, this is not a blank slate. The TDR it's designed to meet the community's needs. So, not necessarily envisioning no development on these parcels. Many TDR programs allow for certainly the unit where in the farmland context, which is widely used and which I speak about a lot because of that, the farmer's dwelling is often there. There's often provisions to allow all the types of accessory uses that accompany agricultural production, and then certainly the opportunities for heirs to live on the property could be part of the program. Okay. And in regards to the second piece, I can't say that I've seen the ability to sell over time as part of any existing programs that I've looked at.
Okay, great. And I may have some more questions at the end, but Mr. Chair, for now I'm good.
Commissioner Kipp, you recognize.
I thought this was fascinating taste of what it is. And I am really interested, and I'm sure several other commissioners here would be interested in hearing more about this in terms of, I'd really like to see some specific, if you could show us from other communities, especially you said rural to rural is a transfer that those are big in Florida. I actually thought that might be addressing Commissioner White's question. I wasn't sure when you had said that. And so I think some real specific ideas to give us a concept of what exactly how this has worked in other communities. In all those instances, I think would be something that we would want to learn. And I just think it's really fascinating, and I'm just looking forward to hearing more and more specificity about how we can kind of apply it or imagine applying it here.
Absolutely. These are complex programs, and I didn't want to get too far in the weeds, but I certainly have a lot of additional data I'd be glad to bring to the board.
Just one more thing. Howard County, I don't know if that was in Maryland, right next to Montgomery County. I don't know. I think it's like Maple Leaf or Maple Lawn or something. It's a huge development that was done out in the middle of nowhere in Howard County. That's like in between Baltimore and Washington. So I don't know if it seems to me, it strikes me as being a place that was probably done the way that it looks as something like a transfer of development rights. Are you familiar with that? I'm just guessing.
That's not one I'm familiar with in particular. I think probably the most well-known of the rural-to-rural transfers in Florida is Ave Maria in Collier County.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
No, let me ask you a question. I thought about this. You said Florida had 20 of those counties that were doing this?
There are 20 counties in Florida that use TDR.
Are they urban, rural, what, is it a mixture of?
It's a very rich mix, and I should specify this is TDR for the context of growth management, so there are TDR programs for historic preservation. So when I say 20, I'm talking about 20 Florida counties that use it for growth management, to guide growth from, and it's a diverse mix. I will say that, this is an area that I can talk about endlessly, but traditionally they were used in the coastal counties where you had growth. TDR programs are always tied to development demand. They've got to be because it's a market tool. But increasingly you see them in our rural areas tied to a lot of the sector plans and development strategies that are happening in more rural and internal parts of the state.
Oh, wait. Sorry.
Commissioner Smith, you recognize.
Hi. A fear that I have about this rural to rural transfer is that, as you say, it's something like Ave Maria, where we go out in the rural area and we take some land that should be left alone, should be maintained as rural with some environmental natural resources much like the plan that we were shown in the middle of nowhere that, as an example, by Chris Sinclair at our last land use workshop, where you've got some pristine agricultural area that's functioning well as agricultural area, and then you make a subdivision or a large development there by saying, you know, let's take some of these development rights and put them all here. So it's rural to rural. You know, it seems to me the best way, a better way to protect the rural area, and I think this gets to something that Commissioner White was talking about too, about, you know, when you have land where the landowner is allowed 10 units on 100 acres, say, or whatever, or it would be 20, I guess. The best way we have to protect that is to simply, we're the policy board, we can say no. We can say no, we're not going to add any additional density. So when, you know, thinking about additional density that they might have, we don't have to buy that. We can just, or transfer it or anything, we can just say no.
Yeah, I'll offer just a few thoughts on that. So having looked really carefully at Florida's programs in particular, where these rural-to-rural transfers have really dominated, these are primarily in the rural interior where there are really large land holdings. So Blue Head Ranch in Volusia County is an example. So you're talking about typically sort of large previous cattle operations. My understanding is that in that context, these are sort of negotiated bilateral agreements with a large landowner. And my understanding is that that's a really different context than we're looking at in Hillsborough County, that when we're looking at the rural and agricultural lands here, the ownership is far more fragmented, smaller land holdings. So offhand, I would say probably a rural-to-rural solution is less likely to be desirable here. And we also have really desirable urban areas where additional density could be demanded. So offhand, I'd say there are tremendous opportunities for rural to urban or perhaps rural to fringe transfers here, but I think the dynamics that I've seen in looking at some of the data Christine collected that was really compelling about land ownership in South County, I'd say the rural to rural is less a likelihood here.
And the other thing that pricked my ear was when the note on, I think it was a slide previously, about the number one reason for failure is if developers could easily get these development rights without having to buy them. So if we as a policy board are handing them out like candy, then they don't have to buy development rights from anybody else. We'd have to have some kind of a program in place that says, you know, in these areas, or maybe something that comes to mind is maybe a town center, Waimama's town center, or the Gibsonton, I don't know, some kind of town center where we want development. We say the only way you're going to get them is by transfer of development rights. I mean,
well, I think local government's role, local government is building a market in this case, so they can either give away the credits, and at the same token, they've got to prime the pump a little bit, and they're associated kinds of investments, whether these are transit investments or economic development strategies, where a developer is willing to pay for the potential option to increase density.
Mm-hmm.
So those are the two sides that local government has to be attentive to with TDR.
Well, say it'd have to be someplace that's really attractive, like some transit or new transit hub that had this extra value, and then we say, we're going to allow the extra density by selling the credits, and that's a lot of food for thought. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Commissioner Overman, you recognize.
And that's why actually having a good growth strategy is so critically important. In a lot of our agricultural and rural communities, those that provide the food on our table oftentimes are torn between, being able to do what they do and seeing an increase in value of their property because there's potential development coming, and then they rely on that increase in value in order to capitalize what they need to do to grow. But then when we strip them of their ability to develop on that property, or if we take that away, then their value falls and they have, and they can't actually do their business. So the development rights associated with rural land have value. It has the value of being able to transfer. It has the value of preserving that land for agriculture, or either whether it's ELAP type of preservation, whether it's wildlife, whether it's agricultural development. But having that open space is critically important to our overall economic structure. But if we don't value, to your point earlier, if we just keep giving rights away and don't have anything that incents an agricultural person, a person that's in the agriculture business with the ability to protect their land, their livelihood, then what happens is small farms just slowly but surely ease away. They just go away. So in order to protect our agricultural base in our county, one of the best things we could do is to develop and hold true to what those credits are. And I think that's why, back to your earlier point, why the counties actually manage that process. Because if you leave it to private enterprise, that common good value system doesn't creep into the equation, and it takes away from the county's ability to manage its growth patterns. Is that right? I mean, if I'm reading this right, is that how that works?
So smart growth has really been the dominant paradigm of some of the best planning that's happened in the last decade. But I think that planning researchers have looked at how that's been really oriented toward the downtown, and the benefits have not accrued to the rural communities and the agricultural communities in the same way. So I think TDR is really trying to distribute the benefits and costs of growth and bring some of these the investments that are happening maybe in the downtowns and the new density and the growth, and make sure there's also a benefit equation, and not asking the rural communities to bear the cost and not be part of the development and the new growth that's happening, but in fact to benefit from that. So I think it's very much about sort of broadening the participation in sort of who benefits from good planning.
Mr. White, you recognize.
Commissioner Overman, Dr. Linkus, I very much agree with what you're talking about in terms of spreading the opportunity, giving landowners the opportunity to realize that future value in their land. Commissioner Smith, I hear what you're saying. We can say no now, but large landowners tend to be sophisticated and often carry a lot of clout. And I'm just concerned that, 20, 25, 30 years from now, some of these sophisticated large landowners could have 4 commissioners on the board that will just give them the density that they want. So I would very much like the opportunity to ask some of these large landowners through something similar to a TDR program to come along with us now and let us do this good planning now and really have something that we can all hang our hats on. So that's, I'm just thinking in those terms. I'm taking a real long view here, so.
Yeah, I would just say the cooperation and the economic nexus for those sending area landowners is pivotal for the success of these programs.
Commissioner Kipp, you recognize.
Maybe I'm not understanding something, but I thought, Commissioner Smith, your remarks were right on, but I didn't see them as being not in tandem with what you're saying. So I didn't see them as being opposing remarks. And my thought, I have to say, when I was thinking of rural to rural, and maybe it's just a conception of maybe not knowing it as well as you all do, or just the different perceptions we have. I was even thinking about outside of the urban service area, but like Waimama inside the urban service area is also rural in some cases right now. So that's when I thought rural to rural, I wasn't thinking of where the line was as much as what I thought the land form kind of was that could be done in terms of like building a town center inside the urban service area while doing the transfer, the development rights outside. So that was just my conception when I was asking about that.
Mr. White, you recognize.
Thank you, and my apologies, Commissioner Smith, if I misunderstood your comments. Look, Dr. Linkus, I'm going to have some questions for you at the end, but just as you're thinking this over, what I envision is that landowner in my district that's sitting on 1 unit per 5 acre or 1 unit per 10 acre entitlements. Maybe they're close to that fringe and they're waiting for that payday where they maybe get a couple of units per acre. You know, if we can get there, you know, from a legal, economic, and policy perspective, I'm fine with them dividing their property into what they have now, their 5 acre tracts or their 10 acre tracts. I would just like to see some kind of a program where we can help them realize that potential future value without them actually gaining the development entitlements and engaging in the development. I don't know if we can get there, but that's sort of what I'm envisioning. And I agree with you wholeheartedly. I think that the days are gone that you can do a rural to rural in Hillsborough County, but I think we have some tremendous rural to urban opportunities. So I do have more questions at the very end, but if you would just be thinking about those ideas, I'd appreciate it.
Absolutely.
So we are almost to the very end, so a couple more things. So knitting it all together. And so you have the 4 elements we're going to pull together, and I think the discussion we just had illustrates the need and the value of pulling those elements together. So when you're looking at environmental land, there are some lands out there that are environmentally pristine that haven't been protected, where the TDR may be prioritized in that area. And there are other lands that could be rural areas where 1 to 10 acre lots are appropriate. So just understanding the different values of land in the overall system, understanding where the receiving zones can be, the value that's being added by transit, and how can you capture that value through a host of mechanisms, including TDR. So that's really the purpose of this, is so we can understand the what and the where and get on to the strategy questions that you all are having and address those questions as we move forward. And again, the purpose is to have a framework and a bridging plan that can feed into the comprehensive plan, community plans, and a host of other implementation activities that not only the county is taking on, but its partners are taking on, such as FDOT with wildlife crossings, such as HART, such as your adjacent counties. So that's the intent and the purpose, and with that, that concludes my presentation.
Okay. Mr. Garces? Hold on, Ms. Garces, hold on. Commissioner White, you recognize.
Mr. Chairman, I cannot promise that I'll be so brief here, and that's the importance of these
Cannot
work.
promise you won't be in here by yourself, but go ahead.
I get it. But look, these workshops are the time to get things on the record. Staff wants to hear from the board, so I just think it's important to get some things on the record. So, you know, I wholeheartedly agree that steering growth makes the most sense. And you know, now is the time to address questions like the what and the where of growth. I do concur with the 4 focus areas. I'm of the humble opinion that we should enhance and realize the potential of the innovation district, that we should determine what is needed along the I-4 corridor. Coordinating with the city of Plant City will be critically important in that endeavor. And I continue to believe that we should enhance and bring forth design standards for the Brandon corridor. I also believe that the Little Manatee South planning area is important, and I know we've agreed to treat that separately as part of the task force. I think we meet for the first time next week, Commissioner Smith. Looking forward to it. Mr. Sinclair, a question for you. Can the recommendations of the Little Manatee South Task Force eventually be included as part of this strategic framework?
I think they need to be.
Okay.
I don't see how they could not be.
Okay. We had, I guess I'll go on the record with this. We had toyed with the idea of having Mr. Sinclair join us at these task force meetings. Okay, we'll.
That was my understanding from the last discussion, yes.
Okay, we'll have further discussion on that. So I have heard talk of, and I think it was touched upon in today's presentation, a sector plan concept. So, Mr. Sinclair, can you talk a little bit more? I'm unclear as to whether or not we're going to move forward with a sector plan
No.
or something that looks like one, though, right?
It's going to have some of the same structure. Again, it's going to have the most intriguing part about the sector plan concept
Okay.
is the ability to put together a framework plan that includes a map and the guiding principles, but this is not going to be an official sector planning process.
Okay. And how will the areas outside the urban service area be addressed as part of this process?
That will be that'll be influenced by, primarily by in my mind, the environmental analysis that we do, the rural preservation analysis that we do,
Okay.
resiliency analysis that we do, the amount of intensity that can occur primarily within the centers and along the transit corridors that will be developed.
Okay.
And I think we'll have a fairly clear picture after we do that about how things balance out and where the pressures may be. And then it comes back to you, and you all have to make decisions about what you want to do at that point. But I don't know where that's going to lead us until we actually get into that analysis.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Linkus, Professor Linkus? You've heard about my wild and crazy point system idea. As we move forward, is that something that you can explore? And if so, would you be looking at the 4 focus areas as possible receiving zones?
Think how to answer that. So I think one of the pieces that struck me in looking at some of the initial strategic framework and looking at some of the ideas around the point system is I'm very focused on, my research has told me pretty clearly that TDR doesn't work in most places. And a lot of that reason is it's not tied to the market dynamics. So my overlying concern, to the degree that I could advise the county, would be to make sure that market viability is incorporated in program design.
Taking the words out of my mouth, that's actually my final question, is whether or not you would be willing to conduct such a market analysis and bring your findings back to the board.
I would be happy to. Yes.
Okay, fantastic. In the context of a point system, for lack of a better term. All right, fantastic. And I'll just close. Thank you very much. I just want to put some general ideas on the record in terms of what we might look at with a sector plan type concept. And again, this is just to put this on the record for staff's consideration. I think we should look at, potentially look at triggers for a timeline for redevelopment activity in certain geographic areas on some sort of a rotating basis. So every couple of years, maybe we look at some different area in the county, like a Gibsonton, that might be in need of some redevelopment activity. I think we should think about preservation of historic buildings, historic areas, and there might be an opportunity for tax or fee incentives or some other tool there to make that happen. I think the county, in being bold, should look at financially incentivizing certain aspirations from the community plans. The downtown concept in Ruskin might be a prime example there. Certainly, I think we would want to leave room for annexations by the existing cities. I think preserving industrial land use is critical. The development department has talked a lot about that in terms of properties that already have that entitlement, including triggers or plans to not allow areas to become over-inventoried, if you will, in things like retail and restaurants. We've seen so much of that throughout the county. The next 3 pertain to Little Manatee South specifically, and these are some area-specific ideas. And I know we'll talk a lot further, Commissioner Smith, at the task force about these. But just to put them on the record here, I'd like to explore the idea of whether or not some sort of environmental Environmental credits could be traded out of the Little Manatee South planning area as we talk about growth management tools, and that would be in lieu of development, of course. I think as we look at Little Manatee South, that a large lot development pattern on the east side, adjacent to Sundance, is important. And I would like to see a large lot or a conservation concept on the Cockroach Bay Road corridor from 41 to the boat ramp. It's a real special corridor. Just some other area-specific ideas. I would like to see the Nest site in Brandon. That's Miss Mosley's property that she's preserved for generations out there. I'd like to see that memorialized in a plan. To make the Brandon Main Street more of a destination for East County residents. I know I've talked about my gastro district concept in the past. Maybe that's not the answer. Maybe that's not the right tool. But okay, great. Yeah. But really, I think we have a real special opportunity there, and you know, the Oakfield and Robertson corridor is sort of a hidden gem, sort of been overlooked. And I'd like to see something bold and creative for what I'll call the original area of Waimama. As we all know, that's the area east of 301. It's laid out beautifully in a traditional grid pattern. We just have so much opportunity there, so I'd like to see some focus there. And I tell you, there are just some incredible long-range views looking to the south over Lake Waimama from 674. So I'd really like to see if we can do something creative and, of course, working with landowners to see if we can find a way to preserve that. And the Church of God has an incredible lakefront parcel that fronts Lake Waimama right on 674. So I'd like to see if we can engage them and work with them as part of a planning concept, such that if they ever decide to surplus or dispose of that parcel, I think it would make a wonderful public amenity. So that's it, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. Thank you for indulging me.
You're welcome. Commissioner Smith, you're recognized.
Thank you, and I think it is important that we take advantage of these workshops to have these discussions. It's the only way we can hear each other talk and hear each other's ideas and have discussion among ourselves in the sunshine. So I just want to make sure I'm on record with some of the points that the commissioners have raised that I concur with. Commissioner White's point about large lot development being a third tier kind of in that it provides benefits of protection, second to actually buying the land outright or putting a conservation easement on it or transfer development rights. Having that large lot pattern and farmland is worth protecting for the wildlife corridors that we're talking about, as well as the wetlands and flood absorption areas and other green spaces and other benefits, not to mention preservation of the economic engine that is agriculture in our county. It may change from citrus to tomatoes to blueberries to the next thing, organic farming or whatever, but it's important to have that food source close to us in and of itself. And while I'm on that, while we're planning a framework, I think it's really important we've talked a lot about preserving environment along with, transit-oriented development, but we need to do, and I know Commissioner Merman has talked about this, economic development at the same time, but have these job centers where the housing is. There's been this philosophy that if you make enough houses, magically jobs will appear, and that has not happened. That's just not happened. So we need to really preserve and protect commercial jobs, shopping, services, where we're putting large numbers of houses to try to capture more of those trips. and that needs to be a goal as much as environmental protection is doing these things in a balanced way. I agree, want to make sure I go on record as agreeing with Commissioner Kemp and Overman talking about wildlife corridors being very important, especially, some way to cross that I-4 barrier. And also agree with Commissioner White's point that the Waimama Town Center is really important. Those people have been working, when we talk about, and I see in here some talk about refreshing community plans, that's one where we can really take that to the next level, and the community is ripe for that with all that is going on down there in terms of those Waimama enterprising Latinas and the jobs and education and the circulator system that they're working on for themselves. That's just begging for a town center, especially with the development that we've already put in that area. If I could see slide 24 of the focus areas. And so here's the focus areas, and then if you could also show slide 15 that talks about the community engagement, the steering committees. Slide 15 says the steering committees will be northwest, east, and south steering committees. Okay, steering committees will be northwest, east, and south. Balanced representation, I imagine landowners and citizens and probably some, I don't know who else, but well, who are you thinking of for the balanced representation? The citizens who actually live there.
Right, oh,
And-
yeah. Environmental interests, transportation interests. I think there needs to be landowners involved in certain areas. It's just a representation of different perspectives, yeah.
And then, okay, so northwest, east, and south. And now we go back to the slide 24 focus areas, and tell me how northwest, east, and south steering committees are going to focus on those focus areas, if you would.
That is a very good point, and I hadn't thought about that before. When we were initially coming up with the concept, Lucy and I were talking about, in fact, I think it was in our conversation with Commissioner Merman about a steering committee for the entire county. And I thought that's just too broad, too big. We can't focus in. And so we came up with that initial idea, but I think what you just mentioned makes a lot more sense to me. So we can adjust that accordingly.
If you could show the slide 24.
Sure.
Yeah, because when I saw northwest, east, and south, I'm thinking that's like the rural area. The northwest part of the county and the east and the south are largely outside these focus areas.
Right.
So I would feel a lot more comfortable if our steering committees were actually kind of focused on these focus areas.
And I think, Commissioner, we can look at that. There is some, the focus areas certainly have a purpose of serving as destination points for TDRs. They really are redevelopment opportunities if you look at innovation. And so I think there's a lot of merit in looking at how that gets structured, and I think we can bring that back to you.
Okay.
But appreciate that.
All right. Just not too much longer, I promise. Looking at this slide still, the I-4 corridor has always been a puzzle to me because it's been talked about like, well, of course you're going to put development in that corridor all along the interstate, but then when you really think about it, why? It's not like this is a corridor of roads, like, it's not Dale Mabry, it's not Kennedy, I mean, it's not where you're going to put shops and stuff all along there. It's not where you want to put, I mean, we had a house full of people here not that long ago saying they don't like the interstate going through their community. And here, so I want to be sure we're not talking about putting communities along an interstate as a development corridor. I can see, a gas station and I don't know, big box retail around Walmart or something at an intersection, at the off ramp of an intersection. But I don't see this as the same kind of focus of redevelopment that you talk about when you talk about the innovation district.
So in conversations that I had with the other commissioners, the way the conversations typically went was, you've got this high access corridor in I-4. Jobs tend to locate, near the interchanges, not communities, but jobs tend to locate. These could be opportunities for economic development. Then the question came up, what kind of economic development could it be? One comment was that this could be economic development that could support what's happening up in Innovation District. If that really takes off, this could be a place for high-tech jobs because of the possibility of, not only the access from I-4, but there's a possibility that Virgin could stop in the corridor somewhere in that area. That's something we should explore. Then the question came up, well, what about warehousing and industrial uses? And the question was, well, Plant City is thinking about that kind of a development in Plant City. So we'll have to talk with Plant City about what their economic development potential and thoughts are before we can start really understanding what's going on with this corridor. So it was mainly from an economic development perspective and a place where jobs may go. So that was how the conversations went.
Well, I mean, I can see you don't want to put jobs, a warehouse and tech complex or whatever in the middle of that stretch of I-4 and then have the housing be in commuter suburbs that you're developing in South County, and then everybody's got to be on the road all day. And your other slides with economic centers had economic centers where, you're talking about putting people close to jobs. The I-4 corridor, frankly, is not making a lot of sense to me. If you're going to put jobs and people in Plant City, fine. If you're going to put them in Sable Park together, that's making a lot of sense. But talking about the whole corridor, I'm really not getting it. So I'm just going to put that out there for today. Yeah.
So if I could respond so the I-4 corridor has been the topic of discussion for many, many years, as you well know. Mm-hmm. Recently had an Urban Land Institute study that looked at nodes, really not just linear development along those, but particularly the node at I-4 and 75 where the airport is. The Tampa Executive Airport is in that little triangle, and there are a lot of economic development opportunities that come eventually with an airport. The airport is the Aviation Authority is in the process of updating that master plan. And so the question becomes does that become a node for job housing, kind of economic development along with appropriate housing, but really focused on that node at that I-4 and I-75, which is still further to the west and closer. Some of it is outside the urban service boundary, but in that area. The other node that was reviewed was a node at McIntosh to see if there was any opportunity for future development there. But I don't think that the conversation has been, at least from my perspective, linear development of just more housing and subdivision along the I-4 corridor. It really was in a nodal pattern, and a node specifically, starting with that, looking at that node around the airport for jobs and housing together.
I know it's been a topic for a long, long time, and it's always seemed to me to be something that comes along with this other phrase that we've heard a lot of today, and that is development pressures. And so, you know, a lot of development pressure comes from whoever owns the land somewhere and wants to make money off of it, but that doesn't necessarily make it a good plan. And so, you know, I think I don't know that attracting more traffic to jobs in I-4 from residences in other places or vice versa makes a lot of sense, but I'll just leave that there today. Just a couple more points is this. There's something about a sector plan running through this presentation, and when I looked up sector plan, I mean, and this brings me to Commissioner White, the idea of including Chris Sinclair in the Little Manatee River South plan. The plan we were shown before was a sector plan, and as I looked them up, it was what sector plans do, and that is to take someplace in the middle of nowhere, some rural land in the middle of nowhere, a large piece of it, and develop it, and put, you know, what ends up being a lot of bedroom communities of residences, suburbs, going off to the jobs. In that case, it was between Orlando and Melbourne or something, and that's where the jobs were, so you put the housing here, but while you're at it, you protect the environment. And that was done for the large landowner, Deseret Farms, and that was, you know, what really set my hackles up was the idea of doing that same thing here, and as a sector plan. And I keep seeing sector plan, and you know, it just seems like this development pressure is leading in this same direction. And I know I was told that that's not what we're doing, but it seems to keep being hinted at. So yes to looking at, definitely, yes to looking at TDRs where we can to preserve rural land, looking also at conservation easements possibly, you know, short of full ELAP purchases. But you know, given that this is the same consultant who did this plan for the same customer, I don't know that it sets the right tone to use that consultant for this customer and this landowner in our future plan.
If I may, Mr. Chair. Yeah, so with all due respect to Mr. Sinclair, you know, I think the world of you, and it's been great working with you, but I want this Little Manatee South Task Force to be off on the right foot. So Commissioner Smith, by all means, I'll oblige, and I'll just ask that it's just whatever staff we request to be present at those meetings, and we can always loop in or not loop in any consultant at the appropriate time. My idea there was just to make sure that whatever we come up with as a task force is incorporated into this. But to your point, we can certainly do that, or even not do it on the back end. So, in the spirit of getting this off on the right foot, I'll oblige and you know, again, just request that appropriate staff is present at the meetings as the task force requests.
Last quick sentence is that and thank you very much. I really, really appreciate that. It gives me a lot of comfort. Last quick sentence is to just highlight resiliency as one of the goals of this framework. I think it's something we're going to have to look at with a whole lot more emphasis than we ever did before, in light of new information we're going to be seeing soon in the EPC meeting with the Tampa Bay Estuary Program scientists coming to give us fresh look at sea level rise. And so resiliency for all our infrastructure is something we'll need to incorporate at a different level, in my view. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
When we start planning these meetings again for workshops, have them for 3 hours. You know, I know this is important. We don't have an opportunity to talk, but we're cutting into some other of our folks' appointment times. And I still have 3 commissioners that want to talk. So I know we started at 1:30. Next time we need to go like 4 o'clock. Okay? Get us on our calendars. Commissioner Kemp, you recognize.
Thank you. I agree too. It is the only time for us to talk if we're not violating sunshine. So it's a really important time. And I want to thank everybody for their comments. And I think it really informs my thinking. And I just to point out one thing is we're of course dealing with what we have, which I thought was really interesting, and I've heard this before. Out in our rural area, we have one unit per 5 acres, are kind of like, you know, nothing like out west, 1 unit per 50 acres, or, you know, so that's what we're dealing with when we're talking about the large lots. But I just want to say I agree with all that as a third tier, I think you put it, strategy or whatever, you know, I'll go with that if I have to. And just let it be developed that way. Several other things. In terms of the I-4, I couldn't agree with you more. I don't know what commissioners were asking for it. I'll go on record saying not this one. I was there for the ULI thing, but you know, I did what was presented, not what I desired. So at any rate, and we didn't even, they said don't develop outside the urban service area, and the next day, you know, there was a vote to do that. So anyway, I'll say too that in terms of the warehousing, which I feel like I've asked about, and I know that we're looking at the value added or the value per an acre of kinds of economic development and how that means, and I think that that could really inform a situation like this. But I am not one to, I'm thinking that there's not much economic value in warehousing, and I don't know what our warehousing compares to the areas that we're trying to be competitive, and why wouldn't, I'm thinking, I mean, I'd like to see an economic analysis, like why wouldn't we want that to go to Polk County or Pasco County, have them take advantage of the warehousing and the wear and tear on the roads and all of that, you know, I'm just like not interested, I'm far more, and I see these others as being much more valuable in terms of looking at what I consider the communities that we want to build or the smart growth we want to take. The other is the innovation corridor, and I get worried about that. I hear us saying we're going to transfer the development rights up there, and I'll go again on record saying that conceptually I was like, I know it was supposed to be conceptual, but I just thought that that was a really almost dystopian concept in my mind. It looked like a place, they called it walkable, but with 3 parking garages in the middle, I guess, for automated vehicles, you know, and I just thought it was, and not even considering the CSX tracks that go right through there. I thought it was a really, I think if we're going to do transfer of development rights and give them more opportunity, I'm just wondering about what we can do to dictate kind of that transfer, and so that the development that takes place is not just simply giving them density, but making sure that what's developed there is also good smart growth with a town center that's walkable, and not just saying, oh, we'll just throw all the density because we're protecting the areas out there, which is something I want to do too, but that when we do it and say we're going to throw all this in the innovation district, that we don't let the innovation district be some I don't know what. And I wonder about how much we can more dictate the development in that district as part of the way that we develop it with some tougher standards.
Yeah, that is, to me, that's fundamental to what we're doing, understanding what the urban form of the innovation district as well as other community types, and making sure they're places that not only have density, but that are walkable, have access to transit and those sorts of things. So that'll be part of it.
In concept, and I know it was concept, it looks scary to me.
Yeah.
But anyway, I'll just say. The other was that I also think we have to be thinking about, you know, I agree with you. I'm looking at Sims Road. I'm looking at Gibsonton Road. Like that just looks, Waimama, those places as being like the places where, Ruskin, where we can develop these town centers all within the urban service area, all ripe and ready and to go. I am very concerned about our sewer and water infrastructure. I want to make sure that we just just stop with putting anything over the urban service line. And I want to find out how we do that in terms of water and sewer infrastructure. I want to make that stop. And I want to find out what, I think we probably need a whole workshop on why we don't have it in, for instance, the Progress Village area and the Falkenberg Road area, and how that works with the water and sewer, and what we can do to Gibsonton to bring that there, because I think that that is an infrastructure we need to pay attention to, as well as roads. And finally, I'll just, I guess actually, I know, my final thing was that I know, these charrettes, and I'm not sure, but this is just a comment about this. I know that a lot of times you say, well, we like to go and get the community's ideas and everything. And I'll tell you, as someone who went to charrettes for like 30 or 40 years, I got like really tired of them, because I really did want them to present something that I could critique. I wanted people who had better ideas and could take concepts, and that was their job, and bring them to them and they could say, this is what we're trying to build, not like just have people like that, like me, when I was there, didn't understand or know anything. And I very distinctly remember going to a charrette where I said, why can't we use those tracks, whatever they were at the time, that we already have to put a train on? And they said, no, you've just got to make your own tracks somewhere else. And I was like, well, and I go, doesn't that cost a lot? And they were like, just make your own tracks. Don't pay attention to where the tracks are. And I mean, it just happened over and over again at these charrettes. And it was really uninformed, and it really wasn't valuable in terms of using the expertise that's out there and the kinds of things that you can communicate. So I like it better if you put down a plan and have people critiquing it. And I think it's a more valuable exercise, and it starts to get things going, whether they're like, we hate this or we love this, or in terms of giving a structure.
Yeah, I'm with you on charrettes. It's not a blank slate, and you do have expertise in the room that can guide the discussion. So the way we typically design these engagements, I think the most important thing about the engagement is that people gain a sense of ownership over what ultimately comes out of it. So we design the workshops with that in mind. What information do we need to provide? What discussion do we need to have? But not us dictating the conversation, us facilitating the conversation. They own the decisions that come out of that conversation. So that's the way we put these things together. And I can't emphasize that enough. Ownership is critically important. And if you come to a meeting where people don't feel like they own the idea, it's not theirs, then you haven't gotten anywhere.
I agree, but it's good, I think, to have a basis and have people, I don't know they can design a road this way. I was really impressed when they did Nebraska Avenue the way they did, I would have never thought of that.
Yeah, understood.
Ms. Garces?
So a couple of things I think important is that there is a proposal for someone who's going to conduct economic analysis. And so all of the things we're talking about have fiscal consequences. They have fiscal consequences in how we provide service, whether housing is affordable. So your question about warehousing and distribution centers becomes part of that analysis of the fiscal reality and the economic reality. So that piece is underway, just to keep you informed. The other piece, though, on the resiliency is some time ago, this board sat as the EPC and asked us to undertake a review of sea level rise. And so on one of those graphics, you see the Center for Design and Terrence Sabia's group, who is undertaking now the vulnerability assessment, and they are completing it. They anticipate that some of that should be available for us sometime in June. So that has been underway, and I think that is a very, I've had sneak preview, very comprehensive assessment of those areas of vulnerability. And again, a fiscal and economic reality that travels with that. And I think that's the other piece that Chris mentioned here, is that all of these decisions that we make ultimately have a fiscal side of growth, and that's what we're trying to balance, and is all those four boxes. So those were my concluding comments.
Commissioner Merman, you're recognized.
Thank you, and Mr. Chair, and I will definitely try and make this brief. I just wanted to make some comments. about the framework. I thought it was very comprehensive, well thought out, and we are planning for the future. I mean, really, next 20 years. And I hope that we're going to move forward with the implementation of the framework, because I think it's important that we attempt to do something, but monitor it as it goes along. And I do appreciate the work that you put in, Mr. Sinclair. Just a couple things. I would really like to see the 41, Highway 41 corridor that has Gibsonton, Apollo Beach, and Ruskin that abut up to 41. They are used to be semi-rural. They're transforming right now into not rural communities. They want, they want a center of influence. They want different things happening. So I know that's a focus. Yeah, I saw on your map. But I think 41 almost has got to be separate. It's got the infrastructure, the transit improvements. I mean, it can definitely be its own focus area, as well as 301. Yep. Because those two, as far as transit's concerned, will have different transit components on both of them. I imagine 41 is going to be more bus rapid transit, maybe not, or express bus. 301 is probably going to have BRT on it. I don't know that, but I would imagine they'll be different. So I'd like for you just to look at, because the actual infrastructure along 41 is definitely nowhere like the infrastructure that's on 301. And it is incomplete. It needs help. It really needs more. And I've talked with George and John about this exhaustingly over the years. So I hope that you'll look at that a little bit differently, because they do need help. That's where our road problems are right now, our county road problems, especially in Ruskin. Apollo Beach is going to be improved with Apollo Beach Boulevard and Big Bend. And then you've got Gibsonton that has county roads that definitely need improvement. So I hope you'll look at that. Another one is, I know a conversation someone had with Congressman Spano, as well as conversations I've had with the Brandon Chamber folks, is they really like to see on Highway 60 some transit to be looked at for that corridor, and even including up to and including the Expressway Authority. So I wanted to bring that up. And when you do if you do a 41 corridor just by itself, I think it'd be good to review the community plans of those three areas comprehensively together. And then I hope the regulatory policies that come out of all this are not so much that we can't get anything done.
Yeah, yeah.
I think that's very important going forward.
Yeah.
So thank you, though, for your hard work.
Mr.
Thank you.
So commissioners, if you're ready for next steps.
No, we have one more
We're not.
commissioner.
Oh, then I'm not ready for
No,
next
you're
steps
not ready.
either.
Just hold tight. Commissioner Overman, you recognize.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Actually, to tie all of the concepts that were just described back together, one of the things that I've noticed, because I've been sitting in a lot of meetings these days that have to do with all the overlap we're talking about, is that I notice that Cutter is doing a lot of work for us. They are working on the transformation demand management study to determine how we deal with congestion, where traffic wants to go, where transit wants to go, where people want to go. Which is actually really fascinating, because when you start looking at where people want to go, which is somewhat relates to the spider that we saw earlier, that measures where people are going. They're doing that work. Obviously, we're seeing the work that was presented today through Cutter. we as a board are making decisions with consultants that are working on a variety of these different issues, collectively and separately. But the things that we talked about today overlap in so many ways. You know, I'm looking at transit and trying to figure out how to bring transit to South County, whether it be the BRT, the express lanes, or whether we activate, you know, some negotiated opportunity to utilize the CSX right away. Whether that be that goes parallel to 41 or that runs right through Brandon Riverview. You know, there's different modalities and different right-of-ways available to help people get around in the areas that match up exactly with the I-4 corridor, the Brandon corridor, and the South County corridor, that in our past CSX conversations have not even been part of the equation. And so if we're trying to connect to Plant City, I think it's important that we get that in the mix, because if we're really looking at right-of-way without destroying communities that actually is accessible, we need to have that conversation and make sure it's a priority as part of it. But also what's important to relate to your conversation about I-4 and developing on I-4. We have 2 elementary schools right at McIntosh Road, right on I-4. I mean, literally, if you fell off of I-4, Strawberry Crest and it's a high school, and right next to it is an elementary school.
It's a charter school.
Well, Independence a little bit further down, but there's another elementary school right there. Bailey are right there. And when we build elementary schools, apparently, I've just learned this recently, you know, we build the wastewater and solid waste to that, but we don't necessarily build it to all the community on the way.
You got some problems out there, right?
That makes no sense whatsoever. So if we're going to be talking about growth areas, specifically to your area about 41, and the lack of stormwater and wastewater services in those areas, the massive amount of septic tanks that we have in the Brandon Riverview area, our growth plan's got to match up with those other infrastructure needs. It's not just transit. It's not just houses. It's not just environmental and rural. It's fire. It's stormwater. It's wastewater. It's freshwater. If those issues aren't addressed, if we don't have an inventory of where our lacking of provided that, or where our connectivity to where we do have it, we're about to build TTT. That's off of Baum Road. How many septic systems do we have in that area have we not planned to connect to or replace as part of that growth plan? How many buses aren't really working in the South County because we either cut the route or got to a point where we don't have frequency that people are willing to use it? There's plenty of ridership there. But if it only comes, you know, in 4-hour windows in the morning and the afternoon, and it only shows up every half hour because that's the way we've funded our transit system, that's not going to work either. So I think it's important, whatever our growth plan works or designs, it has to recognize the transition of funding and how that occurs, but also how do we best solve some of the problems that we have in those areas by doing smart growth development. And that's why I do really like the credits program, because it can help us bank some of those areas that we need to protect rural, but also help us fund those areas where we don't have the resources for either the infrastructure or the desired affordable housing that we desperately need. Because that's the piece that I'm going to continually go back to. If it creates an opportunity for affordable housing tied to the transit, which ought to be completely married, and file in line with our urban density, whatever that looks like, you know, the urban service area becomes less important if we don't have the infrastructure within it, but we have it outside. So I think that's an important part to bring to your analysis, is where is our infrastructure, at least the nodes of it that we can connect to, that it makes sense, versus limiting it at the urban service area. So thank you.
Now, Ms. Garces, next steps.
Commissioners, based on this conversation, we would like to bring back then the timeline for at least this the initial phase of all the technical analysis before we go out to communities and before we finalize the design of a community engagement program and how that will work. So we would bring that back to you I think, as an agenda item. Probably by the 17th of July, we could have that for you.
All right. Commissioner Merman, you recognize.
How does school planning fit into all this? I did not see it on the list, and I'm so sorry. I hope I didn't open up another half-hour conversation, because I didn't mean to do that. But, you know, locating these schools, we just had a huge charter school try to go in, and thank heavens they withdrew the application. It was like people were coming out of the woodwork against it. So it's got to be a factor of planning.
In fact, you brought it up at the
I
first
did.
workshop that we had, and that was heard and understood, and that's part of the infrastructure services box.
Okay. Thank you.
Let me say this. Again, I think we need to have these meetings scheduled for a little longer than what we have them for, because as you heard commissioners say, we don't have an opportunity to discuss these very important planning issues because of the sunshine, as Commissioner Higginbotham used to say, sunshine keeps us in the dark. So please do that. Let me also say this. Commissioner Kemp, you said, what were commissioners thinking when we started looking at I-4 corridor? I think there was only 2 of us here when ULI first came in and started talking about the development of I-4 corridor. We weren't talking about going out there building homes all over the place. I'm going to say what I got to do, we're done. We were looking at how can we have smart growth in Hillsborough County as we move down the road. That was 2010, if I'm not mistaken. 2010, 2011, because Commissioner Merriman and I just got elected. And that's what we were looking at. We weren't talking about going there building skyscrapers and everything along those lines. I can tell you right now, the airport authority is looking at the executive airport and the development out there, and I've been working with them on how we can get access in and out of that airport without disturbing. Commissioner Kemp, we're not going down the road on this, okay? Please, come on.
I'd just like to respond.
Well, that's what we were looking at. We weren't looking at skyscrapers and homes all over the place and things along those lines. We were looking at well-planned growth and what we could do in Hillsborough County. And as we can see, it's being dumped down to South County, and Commissioner Merman and Commissioner Smith and Commissioner White, all of us are very concerned about what's going on down there and how do we meet the needs of those folks. So that's what we were looking at. It wasn't what were you thinking, commissioners, when you were looking at this. We weren't thinking about anything along those lines. We were trying to get educated as to what we could do in those areas. Now, you want to say something? Go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to clarify. I don't believe, if you read the record, I said, what were you thinking? I said I just wanted to go on record as not being one of the commissioners that asked for this I-4 corridor when it was said several times that other commissioners asked for this I-4 corridor. I just said I wasn't one of the commissioners that asked for that. That's what I never said. What was anybody thinking about the past? I'm not. So I just want to be clear about that. That was no critique of anything in the past. I just wanted to say I did not ask for it to be on this presentation, that I was part of the ULI, but I didn't. I just want to be clear. It wasn't any criticism of any thought that anyone had or worked on in the past.
Is there anything else coming for us today? Seeing none, we're adjourned.
Thank you.
Well, no, you kind, yeah, because you kind of threw